basically with women's equality, countries become more peaceful, less aggressive, less violent. And women leaders, when they're involved in peace negotiations, help those negotiations or agreements last longer. They're better.
Vanessa Hope, thank you so much for being here today on Underexposed. It's such an honor. I saw your film Invisible Nation a few weeks ago. It's really stuck with me. It seems to have gained urgency by the day and maybe by the hour this week in terms of there being a lot of international conflict with temperatures rising very quickly. And of course, here in America, we have the election coming up. So many reasons why it's the perfect moment to discover this incredible film. For those who haven't seen the movie, Vanessa, could you please describe Invisible Nation for us?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me, Alex. It's an honor to be here on Underexposed. It's helping indie film uh, reach audiences, which is so key. I felt very grateful to have access to Taiwan's first female president, Tsai Ing-wen. We really cover her two terms and everything that's happening in the world. So the film centers her story as it looks at the larger question of this constantly colonized island, Taiwan, and how they are keeping their democracy alive as they deal with the threat of invasion or blockade, the threat of war, and they struggle for their own autonomy, self-determination, and freedom from fear.
I mean, you have something very special in this film, which is access to President Tsai. I'm curious, first of all, how did you arrange that?
Hmm. Luck, timing, access to good Taiwanese producers on the ground in Taiwan, I think all contributed. And maybe some of my background, because I first lived in Taiwan the year 1995-96 as a student, which was when they became a democracy. They held their first democratic elections, but China was firing missiles at us on the island. And I had previously lived in Beijing, studying Chinese over multiple semesters, and I had a huge fondness for people there and language, history, culture. So I was very surprised by what was happening in Taiwan, and I felt to better understand its story, I had to go work in foreign policy. And I'm from New York, so I landed at this think tank called the Council on Foreign Relations in the city. And I learned at the time, this was in the late 90s, that everything was focused, as I had been as a student, on engaging China, but not talking about Taiwan. So the first documentary I directed was actually looking at President Obama's first US ambassador to China, John Huntsman, as a way into the story of the diplomatic relationship between the two countries with the rise of China, which is a foreign policy concern for Americans and people in the world to this day, when you speak about the timing of this film. So I joined this international delegation to monitor that the elections were free and fair, which was a way to be there and work with a local crew and witness President Tsai's win. I mean, that was extraordinary and uplifting, inspiring, historic, landmark. And I just thought, like, I have to figure out a way to have access to this first female president and understand how she will lead differently. Because coming off of the first film, All Eyes and Ears, I felt like the foreign policy world in America, around the world, is very male dominated. And the question of the importance to women, of women to peace and security was new. I wrote a proposal that a local producer in Taiwan helped me submit to the president's office. They knew about the first film, and they liked the fact that I had tried to grapple with all the questions in the US-China relationship, which is pretty much what any president of Taiwan has to deal with first and foremost. And President Tsai came in and listened, and then she came in last. She left first. She got to the door without saying anything and turned around, nodded her head, and then quickly left the room and closed the door. And her side just erupted in this excited applause. And our side was like, okay, I guess that means this is happening. One of the things that struck me in January 2016 when I was there just to film the election win, I didn't know she was going to win, but when she won, she was standing up for this woman who's in our film named Cho Yu, who was a young Taiwanese pop star in a Korean K-pop band who people in China freaked out about because she had a flag for Taiwan in the background of an interview music video, and they were calling her out and they were demanding an apology and forcing her to say Taiwan is part of China, which is the Chinese party line, but not the truth for Taiwan. And President Tsai spoke up for her. So President Tsai speaking up for her in like right before people were voting, I think had a positive impact. And then increasingly, because it was a very critical 8 years that she served.
Being in such close proximity with the leader, people might be curious to know how much control were they trying to exert on you, or how much pushback were you getting from Beijing, potentially while making the film or while releasing the film? Can you speak to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think as a independent American filmmaker, I was particularly on Beijing's radar. But there's pushback. There was a lot to learn in the domestic political party system in Taiwan and how that plays out in the diaspora. Because the impressive nature of the way Taiwan had a peaceful transition to democracy out of an authoritarian military dictatorship is great. But you have to remember that what happened was that military dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek that came from China when they lost the Civil War to Mao and the communists transitioned into just another party in the democracy, the Chinese Nationalist Party, the KMT party. But that means that people who are in that party, which is blue, you say blue leaning, and the Democratic Progressive Party of President Tsai, green leaning, struggle to agree on a future for Taiwan. There's a lot of dreaming about what could be. And I think sometimes that's helpful, often with these major political foreign policy decisions that determine the fate of a country, you don't want to push it. But on the other hand, there were 6 million people living in Taiwan before the 2 million with the KMT came from China. And they had not been happy when the Japanese colonized them. For a minute, they thought the KMT would be their liberators. And then they quickly realized, oh no, they're going to colonize us too and put us under martial law. So there's a long history in Taiwan of the people of Taiwan wanting their voice to be heard and wanting to have self-determination, to have autonomy and freedom from fear of another dictatorship from China coming and controlling them. So, the people who are of the party of that dictatorship are a little less fearful of it, but that doesn't mean their danger isn't real.
She seems to embody so much of the spirit of Taiwan, which is a place that is so exceptional. I mean, what is it? 42% of the legislature is female. It's the first Asian country to legalize gay marriage.
And that was sort of like, oh my God, like this first female president was taking more risk than any previous president in Taiwan's history. And it was incredible that she managed to start a conversation on truth and reconciliation too.
Right.
And I feel like that writ large would also solve their diplomatic problems with China, other peace negotiations and diplomatic problems you mentioned that are all over the world right now, from Ukraine to Israel to Sudan. And war and violence doesn't solve anything. It makes everything millions of times worse for generations after generations. So yes, truth and reconciliation, forgiveness, the ability to accept the truth of the past and move forward and reconcile is really, really key.
You worked on this film for 7 years. I imagine that to sustain your interest and passion for it as much as you care about the subject, there must have been some personal connection that helped you get through it. Can you tell us what that was?
As an American woman who had been a good student and learned Chinese and was living there when they became a democracy and went to work in foreign policy and respected and listened to, Henry Kissinger, who dominated US foreign policy his entire lifetime, and you could say to a certain extent still does from beyond the grave. I was very moved and I felt upset about the injustice Taiwan has faced that America has had any hand in. And in that same vein of truth and reconciliation, what if the United States can do more diplomatically to bring other countries of the world together to have leverage over Xi Jinping at this point to show a way forward for Taiwan where their democracy can be appreciated and respected. Because in 1996, the year I lived there, Lee Teng-hui, who was a completely inspiring, transformative president, he had actually been appointed vice president by the dictator Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Jingguo. And then Jiang Jingguo knew he was going to die, and Lee Teng-hui ascended to the presidency before he opened the country to elections, which he won. But he bridged differences between the parties, and he came to America, that's in the film too, for a speech at Cornell. He was a strong advocate for Taiwan's independence and recognition, and he did it at a time that would have been a really ideal moment for the US to do something, and other countries in the world. And I think it's sad that we're so slow to wake up to foreign policy, diplomatic, peace negotiation challenges on the ground, that we get stuck in old thinking or old policy, or we're driven by certain dreams of money or certain dreams of realpolitik that came from Kissinger, that need to be shed now, I would say, because there's a lot of damage the US has done in the world in its foreign policy and supporting dictators and wars that are hugely detrimental and impactful, and the result is the loss of millions of lives and devastating consequences. So I guess and it's that kind of complicated history that I just felt like I wanted to get into the challenge of it and understand how to translate it out to a wider audience, because the desire in Taiwan to have that happen was so huge, is still so huge. It's very, very moving, and it's very, very dire. I mean, even in the 90s when I was at the council, they were saying, don't talk about Taiwan because it's a hotspot for World War III. That hasn't gone away. It's only gotten more dire, the stakes higher. And so it's really urgent that people understand Taiwan's story before it's too late, because it would be a diplomatic breakthrough to be able to not have another war.
Yeah. Now, in terms of getting the story to people, you've been out promoting it at wonderful festival screenings and other types of screenings. I'm curious about the reaction to the film. You've had some pretty exciting reactions recently. Can you tell us about those?
Oh, yeah. Well, the super exciting reaction recently that we were not expecting, because of the nature of the situation and China's power in the region and in Washington and in Hollywood, the Korean director Park Chan-wook, who's just an all-time favorite, but also one of the world's best directors. He watched our film in advance of our Korean premiere at DMZ Documentary International Film Festival. And he wrote these really moving words of support that was like amazing, and meaningful for people in Taiwan. I mean, it's really meaningful because it's scary to speak truth to power and to kind of go against the grain. It shouldn't be against the grain because it should be one of those completely obvious situations where you have a people who deserve international support and to be allowed to hold on to the democracy they've built. But um, it's rare. And so it was really, really a big deal, really special. But generally speaking, our screenings are, we joke, but it's like if when we have people from Taiwan or connected to it in any way in the audience, it's like they want to testify. It becomes almost the spiritual experience of sharing your story because even the history had been suppressed. When the KMT came and controlled Taiwan, they made it impossible for Taiwanese history to be taught, the Taiwanese language to be spoken. It was all, very much imperialism, a hegemon saying, you learn China's history, that's it. We have a composer on the film who really has a personal story she shares about that, from her time growing up in Taiwan. So, and she did this, like, there's so much passion in her music, in her score. She's the first composer I've had the opportunity to work with. So that was kind of exciting. But it's an emotional movie, even though it's a serious foreign policy subject. It has some moments of humor, sort of, but we try to find some balance, but it's pretty moving for people.